Good morning and a warm welcome to this morning's latest online Llafur event and annual general meeting. I'm Ieuan Rees, Chair of Llafur.
Can you lean over and switch that off, please?
Sorry, slight interruption there. I'm Ieuan Rees, Chair of Llafur, the Welsh People's History Society. Once again, it's great to see so many people in attendance. Thank you for joining us. Before we get underway, one quick housekeeping issue. Please can I remind you all to ensure your microphones are turned off to ensure there's no background noise. Thank you. This morning's session will consist of three parts. In a moment, we're going to have the award of the inaugural Ieuan Gwynedd Jones Essay Prize. After this, we're delighted to welcome our main speaker for this morning, Dr. David Selway, whose talk is entitled Strikes, Lockouts and Collective Memories, Remembering 1921 and 1926, which will be chaired by Stephanie Ward. Then, after a short comfort break, we'll be holding our Llafur annual general meeting for 2021, which I hope members will be able to stay for. We intend to finish proceedings around about 12 p.m. Okay. So it's time now for the first part of today's event, the award of the inaugural Ieuan Gwynedd Jones Essay Prize. Just to explain, today's presentation will be bilingual and so simultaneous translation will be available. To access the translation service, you should be able to see an interpretation symbol, a globe, on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Click on the interpretation symbol and select the English translation channel. When Welsh is spoken, the interpreter will be heard on the channel rather than the Welsh speaker. Please note that when English is spoken, the speaker may sound quiet if you listen through the interpretation channel. If so, you can come off the interpretation channel by using the interpretation button and then return later as required. I hope all that makes sense. Okay, thank you. I'm just going to introduce the Ieuan Gwynedd Jones Essay Prize. Just a little bit of biographical detail on Ieuan Gwynedd Jones. Professor Ieuan Gwynedd Jones was one of the most insightful of Welsh historians. His work collected in Explorations and Explanations, Communities, and Mid-Victorian Wales, The Observers and the Observed, which explored the social and cultural history of Victorian Wales, remains essential reading for all modern Welsh historians. Ieuan was Llafur's inaugural chair and our president from 1984 until his death in 2018. And following a bequest from Ieuan, it was decided to establish the Ieuan Gwynedd Jones Essay Prize in his memory. Grateful thanks are extended to Martin Wright, Sian Rhiannon Williams, and particularly David Selway for organising the Essay Prize, and to our panel of judges for giving up their time and providing such valuable feedback. The Essay Prize will be held again in 2022, open to previously unpublished authors, and essays were invited on any aspect of Welsh social or cultural history, including labour history, the history of political culture, women's history, gender history, and history of minorities. Essays had to be between 6,000 and 8,000 words and could be submitted in English or Welsh. This year, we received 6 entries, and the report from the judging panel indicated that the standard was very high. I'm delighted to announce that the winner of the inaugural Ieuan Gwynedd Jones Essay Prize is Llafur Owen, whose essay, which is written in Welsh, is about the popularity of workers' educational association classes in the Nantlle Valley between 1900 and 1950. As well as a prize of £100 and membership of Llafur for 1 year, Fion's essay will be published in the forthcoming issue of Llafur. Fion, welcome. I'd like to invite you just to say a few words about your essay. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ieuan, for those nice words. And I'm going to speak in Welsh, if that's okay.
Of course.
Diolch yn fawr iawn am y gwahoddiad a croeso i'ch cynhadledd fynyddol chi bore yma. A fel o'n i'n deud, diolch am y geiriau caredig yna. I fod yn oes, oedd o'n sioc neis a chalonogol iawn clywed bod fi wedi ennill i wobr, a do'n i ddim yn disgwyl clywed hynny o gwbl. Dwi'n cofio pam nes i weld y gystadleuaeth yn cael ei hysbysebu'n wreiddiol, a dwi'n cofio meddwl, fysa fo'n gyfle da iawn, cyfle perffaith bron iawn i fi fynd yn ôl at fy ngwaith ymchwil a rhoi cynnig i weld os dwi'n gallu mwy na'm byd ar ysgrifennu traethawd i'w gyhoeddi. Mi nes i raddio efo'n doethuriaeth yn yr adran Gymraeg Mhrifysgol Aberystwyth yn 2019. Ac bod fi erbyn hyn wedi arfer, dwi'n rhoi sgyrsia, darlithoedd mewn cymdeithasau llenyddol, grwpau cymunedol, hyd yn oed yn ddiweddar yn arwain teithiau cerdded yn sôn am yng ngwaith ymchwil. Dwi ddim eto wedi cyhoeddi yn academaidd, a chan bod fi chwaith ddim yn y byd academaidd yna o ddydd i ddydd, i fod yn hollol onast, oedd gweld y gystadleuaeth, oedd o'r math o sgogiad yna, o'n i angen i fynd ati i sgwennu, a dwi erbyn hyn yn amlwg yn eithriadol o falch bod fi wedi wneud, a bod y cyfle hwn wedi bod yno. Dwi chwaith ddim yn dod o gefndir hanes, di gwybod gradd mewn Cymraeg a daearyddiaeth sydd gennau ym wreiddiol lle. Ond bod hanes rwsyd wedi ffeindio fi pam o'n i'n dod o hyd i faes ymchwil ar gyfer fy neithuriaeth. A maes ymchwil sydd wedi gwneud gymaint o fwynhad, a dwi wedi mwynhau o gymaint fel dwi'n methu gadael iddo fo fynd lle, a dwi dal wrthi sy'n neis o beth. Ac y maes ymchwil yna ydy diwylliant llenyddol a cherddorol Dyffryn Nantlla, ardal chwarelyddol yng Gwynedd, wrth gwrs, yng Ngogledd Cymru. A cyfnod yn bennaf ydy hanner cyntaf yr 20fed ganrif. A dwi'n canolbwyntio ar gyfraniad gwerinwyr diwylliedig di-goleg yr ardal. So rhai oedd yn cynnal y bwrlwm llenyddol a cherddorol ar lawr gwlad fel petai. Dwi'n un o'r ardal, dwi'n dod o bentra Groeslont, o'n amlwg pwnc sy'n agos iawn at ynghalon ni a'r diddordeb personol yna hefyd, a fues i'n ffodus iawn yn Aberystwyth i fod o dan arweiniad Bleddyn Hughes sydd hefyd yn dod o Dyffryn Nantlla. A dyna sydd i'n wreiddiol at Gymdeithas Addysg y Gweithwyr. Wrth fynd drwy papurau newydd, llythyrau, atgofion, chwarelwyr a'r gweithwyr a'r bobl oedd yn byw yn y cyfnod, ond na ddim modd osgoi'r holl gyfeiriadau yma at dosbarthiadau, nid unig yn y pentrefi mawr, so da ni'n sôn am pentrefi os da chi ddim yn gyfarwydd ar ardal Penygroes, Talsarn, ond yn y pentrefi bychan hefyd, dyna jyst ddim modd osgoi nhw, ac dwi'n teimlo'n ffodus iawn eto o fod wedi byw bron iawn yn y llyfrgell genedlaethol pan o'n i'n neud yn ymchwil, a'r holl archif arbennig iawn sydd yno lle. Dwi'n meddwl ar un o'r pethau'r cyntaf nes i edrych ar, di gwybod pan o'n i'n cychwyn ar y gwaith, oedd archif Mathonwy Hughes, a lot o nodiadau fo, dosbarthiadau Cymdeithas Addysg Gweithwyr, lot o lythyru fo efo Gwilym Mar yn sôn am y mudiad yn yr ardal lle. Dwi'n meddwl am archif ar Williams Parry wedyn oedd yn athro a'i holl nodiadau dysgu fo a dyddiaduron y pobl ddim mynychu dosbarthiadau, yn amlwg adroddiadau blynyddol Cymdeithas y Gogledd yna hefyd. A rwsyd oedd yr holl bethau ma'n i'n dod ar draws yn yr archifa yn ychwanegol at be o'n i'n dod gweld yn y papurau newydd. Hefyd, wrth gwrs, i gofio cysylltiad Silyn gyda Dyffryn Nantlla ac Silyn yn Ewythr i Mathonwy, wrth gwrs. Oedd o jyst yn neud fi bod eisiau gwybod mwy, ac o'n i'n teimlo bod yna rhyw stori yma rwsyd oedd ddim wedi cael ei deud, a bod angen plethu, a dyna dwi'n fwynhau wneud wrth ymchwilio, plethu yr holl bethau yma at ei gilydd i gael yn y cyd-destun yma y darlun cyflawn yma o weithgarwch y mudiad yn yr ardal. Ac felly, pan ddoth i at y traethawd yma, dyma'r ymchwil gwreiddiol wnes i ddatblygu'n bellach lle. Mynd yn ôl i lenwi bylcha a gwneud yn siŵr bod y gwaith fel bod o'n gofnod o'r hanes, o'r math o bobl oedd yn mynychu, y pynciau oedd yn cael ei astudio, pwy oedd yr athrawon, sut, ac yn bennaf, fel sy'n nodweddiadol yng ngwaith ymchwil i, sut oedd y dosbarthiadau yma yn cyfrannu at yr awydd mawr yma oedd yn lleol i hybu dysg a diwylliant ymhlith y gweithwyr. A cyd-digwyddiad llwyr bron iawn oedd bod Anghara Thomas a'r criw, mae yna 2 ohonyn nhw, wedi dechrau mynd ati'n gynharach eleni i fynd drwy archif Cymdeithas Addysg y Gweithwyr Gogledd Cymru, a does na neb wedi bod trwy yr archif yma o gwbl. A fy mod i eto wedi bod yn lwcus ac yn ffodus i gael mynediad at rhai o'r archifau perthnasol hynny. Oedd unwaith eto yn llawn o drysorau gwahanol a mewn wylediad newydd rwsyd i'r holl waith calad oedd yn digwydd yn yr rhanbarth, bod fi wedi gallu llenwi mwy o fylcha ac adrodd mwy o'r stori fel petai. Felly dwi wedi bod yn lwcus iawn i gael cynnwys hynny yn y gwaith. Ac dwi eisiau diolch yn fan hyn i'r beirniad am ei hadborth gwreiddiol ac i Sian Rhiannon am y cyfle a'r cymorth dwi wedi cael i ddatblygu'r gwaith yn bellach wedyn ar ôl fi glwad bod fi wedi ennill. A dwi wedi cael cryfhau'r traethawd trwy osod y gweithgarwch yn Nyffryn Nanlla mewn cyd-destun ehangach a tynnu cymeriaethau efo astudiaethau ar hyn oedd yn digwydd o ran y mudiad mewn ardaloedd eraill yng Nghymru ag ym Mhrydain. A dwi wedi dysgu, dwi wedi dysgu gymaint efo wrth gael wneud hynny o ran wneud y traethawd, ond hefyd o ran cyfeiriadau eraill fyswn ni wrth y modd yn mynd ar ei hola o ran ymchwil yn y dyfodol. Felly, just yn sydyn, dwi'n gweithio fy hynna jyst dweud chydig bach o gefndir i'r traethawd. Ac hanes cymdeithasol, hanes pobl ar lawr gwlad, dyna dwi'n fwynhau ymchwilio iddo fo. A dwi'n gobeithio bod hynny'n dod drosodd yn yr erthygl. A dwi'n gobeithio hefyd os hynna wedi plesio Ieuan Gwynedd. Yn ychwanegol, wrth gwrs bod ffaith bod y 2 ohono ni fel nifer o bobl efo'r cysylltiad arbennig yna efo Aberystwyth. Felly, mae'n braint cael bod y cyntaf i ennill y wobr yma a dwi eisiau diolch i'r pwyllgor am yr holl trafniadau a dwi'n gobeithio newch chi fwynhau darllen y gwaith pan gewch chi gyfle. Felly, diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thanks, Ieuan.
Diolch yn fawr iawn i Ffion.
Good.
Sorry, Ieuan, go on.
Sorry, no, I interrupted you. Sorry, Sian. Did you want to say a few words? I'm sorry.
Thanks very much, yes. Well, I'm going to speak in Welsh as well. So diolch yn fawr iawn am y cyfieithu. Mae'n hyfryd i weld chi, Ffion. Neis i gwrdd â chi am y tro cyntaf, hyd yn oed dros Zoom, ac oedd yn hyfryd y dod i glywed beth sydd wedi ysbrydoli Ffion fyna, ac i wybod rhywbeth bach am ei chefndir hi. Wy'n synnu bod i ddim wedi astudio hanes yn y coleg, ond wy'n falch iawn i glywed taw hanesydd i fi erbyn hyn, gwych. Mae'n hyfryd hefyd, wrth gwrs, i estyn yn llongyfarchiadau ni fel cymdeithas, a i feddwl hefyd ar ran golygyddion Llafur. Hefyd wy'n siarad ar ran Alun Gwynedd Jones, mab Ieuan Gwynedd, sydd â diddordeb mawr yn canlyniad gystadleuaeth wrth gwrs, ond sydd ddim yn gallu bod gyda ni bore yma. Wel, pan glywes i beth oedd canlyniad y gystadleuaeth ar ôl i'r panel beirniad gwrdd, mae rhaid fi weid bod fi'n fodlon iawn am sawl rheswm. Yn gyntaf, am fod y gystadleuaeth wrth gwrs wedi denu cynifer o ymgeiswyr o safon uchel. A'r traethawd buddigol wedi cael ei disgrifio fel un ardderchog gan sawl un o'r panel beirniad, ac oedd hynny yn galonogol dros ben. Wedyn, bydd rhaid fi gyfaddau, ni'n falch taw merch oedd wedi ennill. Ond hefyd, wrth gwrs, bod hi wedi ysgrifennu trwy gyfrwng Cymraeg. Gan bod fi yn olygydd yr erthyglau Cymraeg ar gyfer Llafur, fi wastad yn wylo am erthygl, ac oedd hwnna'n hyfryd. Ond mae hefyd yn arwydd bod na ymchwil hanesyddol bywiog yn digwydd drwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg, a bod safon wrth ysgrifennu hyn. A gobeithio bydd y ffaith fod gwaith Ffion sy'n defnyddio cyfuniad o ffynonellau Cymraeg a Saesneg wedi dod i'r brig yn help i annog eraill i ddefnyddio'u Cymraeg i sgrifennu a chadw hanesyddiaeth cyfrwng Cymraeg yn hyfyw. Ond y reswm arall, a'r brif reswm falle, pan o'n i mor hapus ynglyn â'r canlyniad, oedd y testun mor addas yn diwedd ar gyfer gwobr sy'n coffau Ieuan Gwynedd a'i gyfraniad. Ac fel oedd Ffion yn gweud, bydde Ieuan wedi bod yn falch. Oherwydd, bod Ieuan wedi dilyn gyrfa academaidd a dal cader prifysgol, ac yn ymchwilydd ac yn awdur penny gamp, a Ieuan ddim i'r coleg, hyd nes y byddai bron yn 10 oed. I goleg cyntaf fe, fel cynifer o'r bobl, mae Ffion yn ei trafod yn ei thraethawd, oedd dosbarthiadau nos Cymdeithas Addysg y Gweithwyr, cyrsiadrwyr post ac ysgolion haf Coleg Harlech. Ac yn un o'r rheini, ym 1942 os fi'n iawn, cwrddodd Ieuan a'i wraig Maisie, ac oedd hi hefyd yn ei haddysgu hunan drwy'r dosbarthiadau hyn. Oedd y ddau ohonyn nhw yn enghreifftiau o'r math o bobl eang i diddordebau a'i gwybodaeth a fydde'n cael ei meithrin drwy gyfrwng mudiad addysg y gweithwyr yn yr 20fed ganrif. Ac yn nes ymlaen, wrth gwrs, daeth Ieuan ei hunan i fod yn ddarlithydd yn rai o'r dosbarthiadau y WEA. Ac oedd y cysylltiad â Coleg Harlech ac yn wir Harlech y lle yn bwysig iawn i Ieuan Gwynedd. Oedd Alun yn dweud, oedd e'n dwlu ar Harlech, nid yn unig oherwydd yr astudiaethau dde wedi wneud yna ar cyrsiau haf, ond hefyd am fod ganddo fe gysylltiadau teuluol ar lle, ac oedd ei fyngiau ar ochr ei fam yn dod o Harlech, ac oedd gyda fe atgofion da iawn o fynd yna i ymweld â'r teulu. Ac os dim amheuaeth dy fi, y byddai Ieuan ei hunan ac mae Alun hefyd wrth ei fodd yn gwybod bod y traethawd buddigol yma'n rhoi sylw dyladwy i bwysigrwydd y dosbarthiadau hyn i'r Gymdeithas yng Nghymru. Ac mae Alun yn falch hefyd bod y wobr wedi i dyfarnu i ddarn o waith sydd mor safonol. Ac fel y person ffodus sydd wedi cael y cyfle i gydweithio gyda Ffion, fel oedd hi'n dweud, i baratoi'r erthygl yn seiliedig ar y traethawd ar gyfer y rhifau nesaf o Llafur, mae rhaid fi weid bod hi wedi bod yn bleser i wneud hynny. Mae Ffion wedi canolbwyntio ar Ddyffryn Nantle, fel oedd hi'n dweud, ardal hollol Gymreig a Chymraeg i iaith yn y cyfnod, ac o hyd i raddau helaeth, wrth gwrs, ac mae'n dangos sut oedd y dosbarthiadau hyn wedi gwreiddio yn yr ardal a'r gymdeithas am ei bod nhw yn addas, yn berthnasol ac yn tyfu o'r hyn oedd y gweithwyr ei hunain am ei gael. Ac yn cael ei cynnal yn Gymraeg hefyd, a hynny gan ddarlithwyr a myfyrwyr diwylliedig a lleol. A mae dyfnder gwybodaeth Ffion am bobl i hardal a'i diwylliant cyfoethog yn arbennig. Mae'n amlwg i bod hi'n nid yn unig yn wybodus am ei phobl ei hunan, ond yn ei parchu nhw ac yn ei gwerthfawrogi nhw a'i diwylliant yn fawr hefyd. Nid yn unig chwarelwyr mae'n sôn amdanyn nhw, chwarelwyr oedd y mwyafrif wrth gwrs, ond hefyd oedd bobl oedd yn dod i'r dosbarthiadau'n amrywiol gan gynnwys menywod oedd yn gweithio mewn gwaith domestig ag ati. Ac mae'r amrywiaeth yna yn dod trwyddo yn yr traethawd neu'r erthygl fel mae erbyn hyn. Fel oedd hi'n dweud hefyd, mae wedi defnyddio archif gwbl newydd, ac mae gwaith hi yn drylwyr ac yn fanwl, ac mae'n dangos dyfnder ymchwil o amrywiaeth o ffynonellau. Ac yn wych hefyd, darllen gwaith sydd wedi fynegu mor gywir a mor naturiol ac wedi gyflwyno mor effeithiol, mae rhaid fi dweud. Felly mae ymchwil Ffion wedi cadarnhau, fi'n meddwl, bod gwaith a chymdeithas dosbarthiadau'r WEA yn wahanol mewn gwahanol ardaloedd. Nid profiad y de yw profiad y gogledd, ac nid profiad Wrecsam a Llandudno yw profiad Dyffryn Nantle. Mae chyfraniad hi felly wedi wneud, mae ymchwil hi felly wedi wneud cyfraniad gwerthfawr. Felly hoffwn ni i llongyfarchu eto ar ran yr gymdeithas a diolch i chi Ffion am gystadlu i chi'n enillydd haeddiannol iawn. Felly, nôl nawr at Ieuan. I'll hand back now to Ieuan. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr. Thanks very much, Sian, Rhiannon. And many congratulations once again, Ffion, on that fantastic achievement. Thank you. Okay, right. I think it's time to move on to the main part of today's event. A talk by guest speaker, Dr. David Selway, on strikes, lockouts, and collective memories. A century on, David will be exploring the relationship between the miners' lockouts of 1921 and 1926 to uncover how individual recollections of both have been central in shaping and reshaping historical narratives of industrial struggle in the South Wales coalfield. To introduce David, it's my great pleasure to introduce our chair for this event, Dr. Stephanie Ward. Steph is a long-standing member of Llafur and is currently a member of the executive committee for the Society. She is also senior lecturer in modern Welsh history at Cardiff University. Steph, great to have you with us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thanks for introducing me. So it's my pleasure to introduce David this morning. David completed his PhD at the University of Sussex on collective memory in the South Wales coalfield, finishing in 2017, and he was supervised by Dr. Hester Barron. After a year of working as a lecturer at Cardiff University, he moved to the Arts and Humanities Research Council, where he currently works as a portfolio manager for heritage research. He's also continuing to work on turning his thesis into a book, with a tentative target date for finishing off into 2026. The talk today is based loosely on a part of one chapter from the thesis, but it's been developed significantly since and is now a work in progress of a new chapter for the book. And I must say this is a really anticipated book as well, which I think will make a very important contribution to the field in all kinds of ways. So David's talk is going to be followed by a discussion, and then the floor will be open for questions. So please do post questions in the chat. This is where we'll be getting them from. And Darren Macy has kindly offered to monitor the chat as well. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David, who's talking today on strikes, lockouts and collective memories, remembering 1921 and 1926. Thank you very much, David.
Thanks very much, Steph. And yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for joining as well on a Saturday morning. I'd say it's lovely to see like so many faces, but it doesn't really work on Zoom because I can't see all that many of you, but it's lovely to kind of see so many people here and to kind of imagine your faces anyway. So it's a couple of months ago, as James asked if I could give a paper at the AGM, and I haven't given a paper for quite a while, actually, probably over 2 years since I last gave a talk, but I thought, yeah, sounds okay, sounds like something I could do. And then it was only kind of a couple of weeks after that, or a few months ago, that I realised I'd actually be the only person speaking at the AGM and the only person given a paper. So there's kind of a bit of added pressure, really, as I can't hide behind everybody else. But many thanks though to James for organising. Really grateful for the opportunity to speak today and for all the work you've done in kind of setting everything up and getting everything organised and promoted and getting it all set up for today. And thanks also to Sean and to Ian and to Darren and the other members of the committee who've been working on this, and also particularly as well for staff for chairing. So as Steph mentioned, the talk today is based on research that I did during my PhD, which was on collective memory in the South Wales coalfield, although the kind of paper today is trying to take it a little bit further and kind of develop a few of the ideas that I kind of put across in my thesis and kind of take them in a slightly different direction. Both the PhD and the talk are both based on, sorry, I'm just going to share my slides, if that works. Are both based on a substantial set of interviews that were recorded in the 1970s in South Wales by the Coalfield History Project, by Howell Francis and by other researchers, David Eeuan, Alan Morgan, Mervyn Jones, and those are supplemented as well by a couple of later oral history projects that were recorded by Philip O'Dolan and Alan Burge. I primarily knew Howell via his work as a historian rather than personally, so there's many other people here today who can speak much better and more appropriately about him. But I just did want to acknowledge, first of all, that all of this work is really based on the very brilliant foundations that he and others laid down and that are maintained today by the staff at the South Wales Miners Library. And this is very much trying to build on what he and others did back in the 1970s. So the Coalfield History Project recorded several hundred interviews, around 200 of which I listened to as part of my thesis. And I'm aiming to use those interviews today to kind of really explore how the miners' lockout of 1921 was remembered by the men and women who lived through it. And then kind of explore a little bit as well the relationship with the more famous dispute in 1926. And it's that really that forms the kind of starting premise for this talk, really. So the idea that the lockout of 1921, when 1.25 million miners were out for 3 months, is arguably, I think, been largely forgotten about today. It's kind of occluded by the general strike and the lockout in both kind of sort of popular memory, I think, and also in the iconography and the constructed histories of the labour movement, and also within the press, media, popular culture, and I think particularly as well in written histories, both academic and popular. There's still kind of a very limited amount of work done on the lockout itself. Really, I think it's the later dispute that attracts the lion's share of the attention, whilst if it's kind of mentioned at all, 1921 is often kind of seen as a kind of dress rehearsal or a kind of warm-up act for the great drama of 1926. In place of fear, in a quote that many of you probably read in the event description, Ieuan Bevan summarizes experience in 1926 as like watching a film unfold that I had already seen made, which hints, I think, at a link between the two disputes. Though I think interestingly as well, you could also possibly read that as suggesting that 26 was more the afterlude to 21 rather than vice versa, which is something I might try to explore a little bit today. And so essentially in this talk, really, I just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about 1921, explore the ways it was remembered in the coalfields, and the kind of loose kind of overall structure for how the talk will go. I'm going to begin with a kind of historical overview of the 21 lockout, which is slightly extended, probably a longer historical overview than I would normally give, but I'm figuring if I claim it's kind of been neglected and forgotten, it kind of behooves me to talk a little bit about it. And then move on then to talk a little bit about its kind of place within the histories of the labour movement, these kind of narratives of progress that might be classed as the sort of forward march of labour. And then finally talk about how it was remembered in the 1970s in the interviews that were recorded by the Coalfield History Project, before finally ending with just kind of a few concluding thoughts. So I'm going to start on the eve of the First World War. In 1913, the coalfield kind of reaches its peak production, this explosive growth throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. And by 1913, 57 million tonnes of coal a year are being mined in South Wales. Much of this is for export, and the exports from South Wales form around about a third of all world coal exports at this time as well. However, underneath these impressive figures, the organisation of the industry is chaotic. There's a chronic lack of investment, there's very low levels of mechanisation, particularly in comparison to other coalfields, and it's really run as an arena for private competition and speculation, rather than as an important national resource. And these facts become really especially stark with the outbreak of war in 1914. There's a huge demand for coal, there's also significant rises in the cost of living, but not in wages, and also what is widely perceived as kind of naked profiteering by the coal owners. Considerable anger at this leads to strikes by the miners in 1915, and then there's further unrest really until the coal was bought, and the mines across the country are brought under direct government control in 1917. In response to this wartime strife, the Sankey Commission is set up to investigate the conditions of the miners and their families, and also to examine the organisation of the industry. And its report in 1919 condemns the kind of present state of affairs and makes a set of sweeping recommendations, one of which is for nationalisation of the industry. At the time, the miners are very much at the peak of their industrial strength. There's been a short post-war boom, which means there's a very significant demand for coal. And they've also forged a triple alliance with allies in the railway workers' unions and in the transport and dock workers' unions as well. And they're very much prepared to use this industrial action and this industrial strength to ensure the implementation of the Commission and its recommendations. However, they are outmaneuvered really by the Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, who is able to kind of head off one strike by promising a pay rise. He also at different points promises to implement the full recommendations of the Sankey Commission, both in letter and in spirit. However, having effectively bought off the miners, he then, as soon as the threat of strike action recedes, he reneges on these promises and the government rules out nationalisation. Over the next couple of years, the economic situation worsens. The industry has been quite overheated by wartime demand, so there's a kind of heavy contraction after the war. And there's also a significant loss or dislocation in terms of export markets as well, which particularly affects South Wales as an exporting coalfield. The industry is shielded for a time, being as it is under direct government control, but then suddenly, so I got post at the door of my dog. Suddenly, then in February 1921, the government announces that state control of the industry will end on the 31st of March, 5 months earlier than planned, and that the industry will return then to private ownership. As it returns to private ownership, the coal owners demand significant pay cuts of up to 45% and a tax on other conditions, which the miners refuse to accept. The miners themselves then make counter proposals for a national sharing of profits and for national wage agreements, so that miners across the country would be paid the same for the same work. But these are also refused. There's kind of no agreement between the two sides, and lockout notices are posted on collieries across the country. So the lockout begins then on the 1st of April with 1.25 million miners locked out and down in tools, including around 270,000 in South Wales. I've got a short video here to play for you as well. There's no sound, so don't worry that you can't hear anything. But a state of emergency is immediately declared by the government. And on the 4th of April, under the Act, troops are moved into the coalfields. On the 10th of April, the battle cruiser HMS Malaya, it arrives in Newport Docks. And the South Wales Argus reports tanks and naval ratings with fixed bayonets marching through the streets of Newport. All leave is also cancelled as well. Reserves are called up, as you can see in the video, and troops are also brought back from Ireland as well, with this obviously considerable unrest at the time as well. In return, the miners' unions call for the withdrawal of the engine men and the pump men and the safety workers, who are the workers that basically keep the mines operational in a kind of fit state of repair, and who, without which the collieries would rapidly deteriorate and become unworkable. And they enforce these calls through mass action as well. In one such instance, miners from Mardy and Ferndale marched on Wattstown, headed by 3 brass bands and the red flag, and compelled the withdrawal of all the safety men who were still at work. The miners also call on their allies in the Triple Alliance, the railway workers' unions, the NUR, and in the other transport and dock workers' unions as well. And initially, these unions do agree to strike in support, posting their own strike notices to join the miners in action on the 15th of April. However, there's a rather intricate series of negotiations, which I'm not going to go into in too much detail because it is quite intricate, but if anybody would like to ask afterwards, I can go into it a bit of detail after. But essentially what happens, it first leads the miners to agree to the return of the safety workers as a precondition for negotiations, before the leader of the NUR, Jimmy Thomas, then calls off the strike on the 15th of April, a day which later becomes known as Black Friday, one of the most infamous days in the history of the labour movement, and the miners are left to fight on the line. The kind of relevance of this with Black Friday yesterday escaped me until yesterday when I was putting my slides together, and I searched for images of Black Friday, and that wasn't a particularly good idea on Google, because it was didn't get much on industrial disputes in the 1920s, surprisingly. But in South Wales and in other coalfields across Britain, though angered at what was seen as a betrayal by their former allies, the miners settled in resolutely for a prolonged struggle. Soup kitchens are set up across the coalfields to feed the miners and their families. Again, this video doesn't have any sound either, so don't worry if you can't hear anything. And the miners also open many illegal, well, supposedly illegal levels into the hillsides to provide coal and to keep the soup kitchens running. Many mining families also keep allotments. This is particularly true in the western part of the coalfields as well. And these allotments are used to kind of supplement the food that can be bought on parish relief and on credit through the shops. As in 1926, it's very much a community struggle, with women playing a very active role in almost all aspects of the strike, including picketing and intimidation of black flags or strike breakers. And the strike carries on into June, with the miners' resolve really stiffened by the fine summer weather. However, towards the end of the month, the government offers a short-term loan of £10 million subsidy to cushion the blow of the wage cuts. And but on the proviso that this would be withdrawn, this offer would be withdrawn if the miners continue to fight on. Though the offer was rejected by a large majority in a ballot of the membership, it was then put to the district leaderships across the coalfields, the different areas, and the district leaderships voted to accept the terms, and the miners were ordered to return to work on the 1st of July. You can see in the video image as well, some of the kind of pumping from where some of the mines have flooded during the course of the lockout. So the lockout lasts for 3 months, and really ends in complete defeat for the miners. They're subject to wage cuts of up to 45%, and their demands for national agreements and a more rational organisation of their industry lie in tatters. And there's considerable disillusionment and recriminations towards both their own leadership and towards their erstwhile allies amongst the railway and the transport workers. Union membership fell significantly across all of the coalfields, and many collieries don't reopen after the lockout either, leading to mass unemployment. However, the return to private ownership and the huge wage cuts that have been demanded by the coal owners do nothing to solve the underlying problems in the coal industry, which remains very deeply troubled, leading to an even greater confrontation than in 1926 over wage cuts and an increase in hours. I won't go into too much detail about 26, I don't really have the time today, but there are many parallels with 1921 as well in terms of the initial support from the other unions with the general strike, but then the supporting action being called off amidst some controversy. And then the miners once again left standing alone with many of the same features of the lockout, the kind of intimidation and the community intimidation of strike breakers, the soup kitchens, the communal feeding and the levels also resurface before they are again forced back to work, utterly defeated once again in the winter of 1926. There's a further round of pit closures after 26, followed by the Great Depression in the 1930s. And this results in kind of mass unemployment and mass migration away from South Wales, which only really ends with the Second World War. And then the miners' demands for nationalisation are finally realised by the Labour government in 1947. Though, as I said before, very little had been written specifically on 1921, in kind of more kind of wide-ranging and sweeping history is often recognised as a significant turning point. In the Fed, for instance, Hal Francis and Di Smith argued that 1918 to 21, that whole period really can be seen as a final flurry of the power of the mining unions and the attendant boom in coal. Whereas more recently, Darrell Leaworthy's argued that the lockout really set the battle lines for the conflict that was to dominate the interwar years. So I want to move on in the second part of this talk now, really to talk about how the lockout came to be remembered afterwards, with a particular focus in the second part of the talk on the kind of heroic narratives and the kind of constructed histories of the labour movement. This use of this sort of long history of strikes, protests, uprisings, and so forth, which are kind of used throughout the 20th century, really, to kind of inspire and legitimate both contemporary and future struggles. And this kind of narrative, this idea of the forward march of labour, is perhaps the most obvious way in which 1921 is remembered, where it's kind of linked with the Charterstreisen and Merthyreisen, with the Tonypandy riots, with the general strike in 1926, and then later on with the hunger marches and the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War. This is in this linked really in this kind of very heroic sort of narrative of working class struggle and of progress through struggle. And this is actually quite a linear and teleological sort of narrative. What I mean by that is that within this framework, time is conceived of in a very sort of linear fashion with a very clear beginning and an end point, and then a kind of sequential narrative that charts this history of progress from that beginning in the past and through to that end in the promised future, which you can kind of see, I think, quite illustrated really nicely in some of the sort of post-war banners of the different lodges. And it's been described as a kind of teleological form of utopianism. What I mean by that basically is that the utopia is basically that is being imagined, the kind of socialist commonwealth or the New Jerusalem or what have you, is placed far into the future, and then history is then kind of ordered into this narrative leading up to and into that, which is kind of what's sort of meant by teleological. And there's actually efforts to incorporate 1921 within this historic narrative, even actually during the middle of the lockout itself. And such attempts reach much further back even than the Chartists or the Merthyreisen. So in April, less than 4 weeks into the strike, Reverend J.T. Williams from Abercynon declares that there is nothing new under the sun. We read of a strike in the second book of the Bible, the brick strike of the Israelites. The genesis of our direct action can be traced back to that great labour leader, Moses. Most examples don't stretch that far back, obviously, but these attempts do become much more prevalent as well once the lockout ends. So the Colliery Workers magazine, the kind of official journal of the South Wales Miners Federation, the South Wales Miners Union, throughout the mid-1920s, does this repeatedly through a kind of series of editorials and articles. It publishes a letter from one miner, for example, that excoriates those claiming that strikes are of no use, arguing that if we were to analyse the footprints of time on the road to progress, we would see the indelible mark of strike action across every step we made. Elizabeth Andrews, a figure will be familiar, no doubt, to many people, the Labour Party organiser, references the Chartists, Ernest Jones, in her exhortations to the women of the coalfield to rise again following the defeat. Whilst another particularly stirring article, I think, reflects on the appalling conditions in the past century and how much progress had been made. Those who achieved the freedom of the coal slaves have not had statues erected to their memory. They were just rebels, agitators, stirrers up of strife, and orthodox historians have passed them by in silence. But the memory of their struggles should live in every miner's heart. Let us be proud of the name agitator, while there is yet a single oppression to agitate against. Our cenotaph, our memorial to the pioneers of progress, must consist in a living, growing army of men and women determined to further social justice. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in his grave, but his soul goes marching on. And you can see the kind of references here with the kind of inspiration drawn from the abolitionist movement in the United States as well. The purpose of these narratives is fairly kind of obvious, I think. It's really to try to lift the miners out of this kind of despondency following what is quite a bad defeat, and to kind of rally them to future efforts and to further struggle. And it's kind of really kind of legitimating the idea of direct action and collective struggle against what is really at this time a kind of onslaught from the press, the government and the coal owners, which are kind of depicting this strike as a disaster and kind of really rubbing the miners' faces in it. And in kind of trying to contrast this, they're trying to give a bit of perspective really on how far they've come and try and present 1921 really as a sort of temporary setback. This very much then continues throughout the interwars as well, particularly after 1926. And Llafur Bevan in particular makes considerable use of kind of references, particularly to the Chartists. Other political figures, both Labour and the Communist Party, also draw on such examples. I think the novels of Lewis Jones as well, Comedy and We Live, can probably be seen as part of such an attempt as well to some extent. But probably what's the most striking evocation of this during the interwars comes at the Fed's May Day pageant in 1939. I'm not going to read out the quotes, but I'll just leave them on the background if people would like to look at them. But this pageant, which kind of is staged simultaneously in 3 different locations across the coalfield, stages a series of dramatic episodes from the coalfield's history, acted out by a huge cast, beginning with the Charter strikes in 1839 and the trial of its leader, John Frost, moving through the beginnings of trade unionism, the Tonopandi riots in 1910-11, the general strike in 1926, and then finally before concluding with the International Brigades and the Spanish Civil War in a speech from someone who's just returned from Spain. And I would argue here, I think that 1921 is perhaps almost inconspicuous in its absence here. By this point, it is really becoming eclipsed by 1926, which I think is quite understandable given that there's a much more positive and inspiring story you can tell about the later strike with the fact that there was the general strike, even if it does end again disappointingly, but certainly much more positive than Black Friday. And if you note, it's actually in the pageant as well, it's the general strike itself rather than lockout. It's that celebration of working class unity that makes it into the pageant rather than the minor struggle alone afterwards. It's also a longer, much larger and much more dramatic dispute. So in several senses, it's much more suited to this kind of heroic narrative as well. The fact as well that 1921 and 1926 are so similar and there's such striking similarities between the 2 lockouts also means that they can very sort of easily be linked. So people kind of tend to bracket them both together and they'll kind of talk about 1921 and 26 or reference 21 and 26, but then just talk about the experience of 26 on the lockout. And so it's really kind of during this period, I think that 21 really starts being included within these kind of constructed histories, within this kind of this idea of the forward march of labour. And this very much then continues into the post-war period. With the other pageants and the kind of commemorative publications that come out with a series of anniversaries, particularly in the late 1940s and early 50s. And then also then again into the strike in 1972 and 74, when it's overwhelmingly 1926 that is used as the reference point. I'll move on to the kind of third and final part of the talk then. Is at this point really that the in the 1970s that the Coalfield History Project, Howell Francis, David Egan, Alan Morgan, Mervyn Jones, recording their interviews. And it's in this last part of the talk, which is the main section really, which is where I want to talk about how the lockout was being remembered in the 1970s by the men and women who'd been out and who'd lived through it. I think the first and most important thing to note is it is actually very widely remembered. So as mentioned, I've listened to around 200 of the interviews, and although I can't speak for how statistically valid as a representative sample that is, there are 74 people in the interviews who speak directly about their experiences in 1921, compared to around about 115 for 1926. So although the later disputes still very much more widely recalled, 21 is by no means eclipsed within these kind of, as it is within these heroic histories that the Union knew that the political struggles are constructed. It's kind of still very widely remembered amongst people in the goldfield. And it's not simply a case that it was just being remembered or being talked about because it was being asked about either, although sometimes the interviewers do ask specifically about the two lockouts. Very often memories of 21 arise completely unbidden or unprompted on the tapes. So they come out of conversations about the war or about wages or about when people started work or got married. And kind of as people kind of give their account of kind of starting work or getting married or whatever, they kind of switch into this kind of memory of the lockout in 1921. Some of these memories do very much place the lockout as well within a kind of wider history of strikes, as the kind of forward march of labour sort of narratives do as well. W.T. Koenig, for instance, a Glencorrug miner, is asked, he's one of the ones directly asked, for instance, whether he remembers the big strikes in the 1920s and the strike in 21. And he replies, 1921, I go so far back as to say when I was a boy, before I was 10, the holiest strike, that's holiest strike in 1893, that was, they were coming out and they'd been marching over the mountain to Resolven. I remember the time well when they went passing some farm or place they broke into, and they stole a lot of apples somewhere, and that is the holiest strike. I remember the strike in the Rhondda Valley, the big strike. Remember Winston Churchill had the fault of sending soldiers to the Rhondda. And shortly after we came out on strike for the minimum wage, we were out on strike in 1912, another strike. Oh, I've been in several strikes, but the worst of all was the 21 and the 26. So being asked about 21 and being asked about the strikes in the 20s kind of sparks this memory, this long history of strikes, where the lockout is placed in this kind of linear sequential narrative, going back from the holiest strike through to the Tonypandy riots and the Cambrian Combine strike, the minimum wage strike through into 21 and 26. Although it is obviously admittedly a lot less positive than perhaps the pageant is or some of the other examples they've given. But for the most part, 21 isn't really being remembered in this kind of sort of linear framework. Is not really being linked sequentially with the other strikes and lockouts, but rather is actually being seen as a fairly exceptional time, a kind of watershed moment. Around a quarter of those who mention 1921 or reference it in the interviews remember it as a crucial turning point in the fortunes of the coalfield. And it's not a step or a stage within a particular narrative, but rather a kind of central focus point around which memory kind of coalesces. Everything beforehand was kind of leading up to it, and everything afterwards is in its shadow and kind of happening as a consequence or a direct result of it. And you can see this in lots of interviews where they talk about 21. I'm just going to give one example from a colliery worker called Bryn Thomas from the Amman Valley. He was actually asked, for instance, about the First World War here, but as he kind of gives his memories or his experiences during the war, he then kind of moves on to talking about the post-war period and says, the men were coming back from the First World War and everybody was enthusiastic and there was peace and prosperity in the mines. They were going at full employment. Everything was quite prosperous. The money was pretty good because it was what we call the period of the war wages. It went up and up until 1921. The peak period came in 1921 when the wages were, well, I was 15 and having £2.03 a week in March 1921. By June, I was having £1 1 shilling a week. So you can see this kind of stark memory of the kind of over-halving of his wages here as a consequence of the lockout. And he kind of returns to this then throughout the interview, keeps coming back to 1921. So when he's asked about experiences in 2 years, it's always kind of, oh, well, that was because this happened in 1921 as well. And it's kind of really seen as a turning point. And in fact, it is 1921 that is, although 1926 is perhaps a little bit more commonly remembered in the interviews, it's 21 that is really referenced as the turning point rather than 26. A miner called John Jones, for instance, from Nantymoyle, was asked directly, in 1926 there was a big strike, wasn't there? And he responds, 1921, man, that was the big strike. It's important, of course, not to kind of overstate this. So I could give plenty of quotes, for instance, people saying similar things for 1926. And even if 21 is more commonly seen as a turning point, the overall numbers, as I said, are still kind of larger for 26 as well. But really just the purpose of doing this really is just to emphasize that it really is not a forgotten dispute within the mining communities, whatever its secondary nature amongst the kind of wider public or the press or the media or within kind of histories afterwards, all these kind of narratives of the kind of forward march of labour. But what is especially interesting, I think, is the way in which 1921 is remembered, or what is remembered really of the lockout. Overwhelmingly, the memories of 1921, and this is also true as well, just as true of 1926, are of the soup kitchens under the communal feed-in, also of the coal levels that were illegally dug into the hillsides to keep the soup kitchens running, and also as well the support from the shopkeepers and the support, the glorious summer weather. The soup kitchens are referenced by over 2/3 of the people who remembered 1921. I put a couple of examples on this slide and the following slide. I won't be able to read them all out, but Ben Davis, for example, who's a miner and a Communist Party member who's originally from Ferndale and Rhondda before moving to Seven Sisters after the lockout, remembered that he was in Ferndale during the strike, and that was a very nice summer again. Right through the summer, we had good weather. Quite a few, at least, of the miners opened up out levels on the hillside and dug coal for their own use and for many others who wanted coal to burn. We were fed anyway because there were soup kitchens and we were having breakfast, we were having dinner, tea and supper. We were having cooked dinner every day and bread and cheese and pickles for supper, a little snack in the afternoon. And at this point, he's kind of interrupted from his kind of fond reveries about the kind of food that he had in 1921 to be asked kind of more pressing questions about the nature of the lockout and his political activism. But this is the kind of predominant memory, I think, for a lot of people, is really of these sort of elements of the lockout as well. And this is true even for people who weren't able to go to the soup kitchens, for instance. So Mrs. Jones, unfortunately, the first name isn't on the kind of recordings or the transcripts, but she, for instance, here she's asked about her marriage or when she got married. And she remembers how they got married in 1920, 3 days in and 3 days out, not much luck. And then the strikes were coming, everything was hard to get. The little one, she was born in the 21 strike. Well, then we weren't having a penny from anywhere. Well, there were soup kitchens then, but I couldn't go because I was going to have my baby. Interestingly, many also had quite positive memories of the shopkeepers as well, who quite often within the kind of literature and the poetry relating to the coalfield that discusses the strikes are often kind of depicted quite negatively as sort of class enemies or people not really supporting the miners in their struggles. But almost all who mentioned them in the interviews remember them quite fondly as well. Mrs. Phillips from Ystrad Gynllais was asked how her family had managed in 1921, and she responded, well, I tell you that the rent collector, he didn't come round to fetch the rent, and we were buying in a shop. She was very good. We had everything we wanted. We didn't miss anything. There's another example there from another miner, Mervyn Payne, as well, which I won't read out because I don't want to kind of read out too many things. But many others as well also kind of recalled the glorious summer weather. So John Holland of Untitled, a miner who was 16 at the time of the lockout, recalled how it was such a glorious summer in 1921. The biggest part of the boys was camping up out on the mountain here. It was a glorious summer, that, and the best summer as ever I can remember. It was sunshine all the way. Nobody didn't want to go back to work. And then they'd come down in the evening from the mountain and they'd sit in the streets on the corners and they'd all congregate together and then they'd start to sing. They'd be out there till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and then those that was camping out would trot off back up to the tents, which I think is quite such a sort of lovely kind of evocative image of the kind of experience of the lockout as well. At the opposite end of the coalfield, a miner called Henry John from Abercrave, he was 21 years old at the time of the lockout, had similar experiences, recalling how he camped with the other boys right through the 21 strike on the mountain, and that they'd had a terrific time. Well, I've given kind of a few examples here. I haven't even read out all the ones on the slide, but there are dozens and dozens of these in the interviews, and you'll probably be with some relief to hear that I'm not going to kind of go on kind of repeating them and listing them all. But I just really want to emphasize really that these memories, they're the memories of the soup kitchens, of the kind of coal levels, the summer, the support from the shopkeepers, are really widespread. They're right across the coalfield. And the soup kitchens as well, in particular, are very widespread amongst both men and women. And that's also just as true for the memories of 1926 as well. It's a very, very similar story. They're also, what's quite interesting, is being remembered as a collective experience as well. People remember what the community was doing and intersperse that with their kind of own personal experiences. We is used very, very often, for instance, rather than compared to I or my in the transcripts and in the interviews and the recordings. And it's also obvious that they've been talked about. People who didn't even experience them kind of remember them, which kind of suggests that kind of implicitly sort of suggests that they're kind of still being discussed in the years afterwards. Whilst in several interviews where kind of spouses or children or other family members are present, they also kind of interject in the interviews as well to remind the person being interviewed to tell particular stories about these experiences in 21 and 26, which I think is a much more explicit suggestion of how widely they're still being discussed. So this is genuinely, I think, a collective memory of 1921, and it really is the collective memory of 21 and of 26 as well, amongst those who lived through it. Having said that, there's probably a few things I should acknowledge and really note here as caveats before moving on, because I suspect there's probably many questions already forming in people's minds about some of this. For one thing, this is very much to extent a memory that's heavily shaped both by age and by gender. So whilst the soup kitchens are a relatively universal memory and experience, the memories of the kind of glorious summer and the 3 months off work are very much a kind of young man's memory, really. So note the examples that I give here are miners who were born who were aged 16 and 21 at the time of the lockout. People who were older, and particularly women as well, who had a lot more responsibilities in terms of kind of keeping families going without wages for 3 months, had a much harder and more difficult time. And those sorts of memories do appear much more commonly in interviews with older people or people who were older at the time, and in memories of women as well. Interestingly, there are lots of women who have these similar positive memories of the kind of glorious summer of 26. But there's very few examples of that for 1921, which might also be a factor of age. It's also important to note as well, I think, that there's clearly an element of nostalgia as well to a lot of these memories. So people are reflecting here from a distance of more than half a century. The memories of the soup kitchens, the community feed in the summer, are probably being romanticized to some extent, and indeed they have often been kind of critiqued as such by historians, and to a certain extent dismissed as kind of being sort of sentimental and nostalgic. You can also kind of critique individually a lot of the kind of individual elements of these memories as well. So you could ask, for instance, whether the shopkeepers are really being motivated by community feeling or pragmatism, or whether it's just pragmatism really, with the fact that in many communities, the miners, they're only customers. So if they don't keep them during the lockout, they're not going to have any customers either afterwards. And many people as well mention kind of paying off debts for years afterwards as well, which suggests that this wasn't entirely a kind of an altruistic act. The soup kitchens as well, they're very much a response to very genuine hardship. The coal levels also are very, very dangerous. In Bert Lewis Coombs's memoirs of his time as a miner, These Poor Hands, he talks about a man being seriously injured in one of the coal levels in 1921, for instance. And you can also wonder whether the weather was really as good as people were remembering it, or whether this was simply the fact that for the first time in a long time, a lot of people just had 3 months off work to enjoy the summer, and therefore experienced it as a particularly good summer rather than being stuck underground. More broadly, I think you could ask kind of what's the kind of people, or what's the purpose of saying this, or why they really matter. You could kind of think, of course, young men and some young women as well would have had a good time with 3 months off work over a summer with few responsibilities. The soup kitchens are kind of almost inevitably exciting, I suppose, if you're a child at the time as well. And are these kind of points not just kind of really obvious, and is there really any wider relevance or significance here? But I think there is, and I think this collective memory, to emphasize it very much as a collective memory, is really interesting, because at its root, I think you can argue that these are examples really of people imagining or remembering rather a better world, one without the dangerous and the backbreaking labour underground, where in the winter you'd only see the sun on a Sunday. One where when work was required in terms of the coal levels of the communal feed-in, it was based on solidarity and mutual aid and communal need. And one where arguably the kind of class divisions within these communities were eroded or erased, even with shopkeepers joining the miners as part of that community struggle. Whether that actually was true at the time or not, it's still very much how it's remembered. And one where perhaps most aspirationally of all, there was a South Wales with good weather. The fact that it is remembered in this way, I think, is still very significant in itself, regardless of whether we critique kind of individual elements of those memories and question whether they might be romanticized. And although these memories may not appear kind of particularly as radical or as politically significant as these kind of very stirring narratives of the kind of forward march of labour, they still very much as well are challenging ideas about 1921 and about industrial action more broadly that are ubiquitous within the press and the fledgling broadcast media, which are kind of depicting them really as disasters that have brought nothing but misery and suffering upon the miners and their families. And in defiance of these narratives that are framing the lockouts in the language of catastrophe, disaster and defeat, people within the mining communities are collectively recalling the experience instead as a positive and happy one. Furthermore, in contrast to the narratives of the forward march of labour and those kind of linear teleological narratives, as I said, of progress through struggle, which place that utopian idea, the New Jerusalem or what have you, at the end of the journey into an imagined future, within this collective memory of the summer in the soup kitchens, that imagined utopia is placed really within the lockout itself. The lockout is not a step on the road to somewhere better, but it was the experience of those 3 months in the action itself that was that change. In his essay, Theses on the Philosophy of History, Walter Benjamin argues that the class struggle is not just a fight for material things, but also the spiritual things of which those crude material necessities are a precondition. But nevertheless, it is not in the form of the spoils that fall to the victor that the latter, those spiritual things, make their presence felt in the class struggle. They manifest themselves in this struggle as courage, humour, cunning, and fortitude. They have retroactive force and will constantly call in question every victory, past and present, of the rulers. As flowers turn towards the sun by dint of a secret heliotropism, the past strives to turn towards the sun, which is rising in the sky of history. And I think you could perhaps argue that these memories of 1921 could be seen in the same way. So I wanted to finish now briefly just with a few kind of concluding thoughts really about these kind of memories of 1921 and their wider significance and why I find them so interesting. And one of the reasons I find these quite interesting is, this is part of the talk where I perhaps get a little bit abstract, but is really their kind of temporal framework, or how they're kind of conceptualizing time and how time works within these memories or looks within this particular account of the past. Because in this collective memory of the summer in the soup kitchens, 21 isn't part of a linear chronology. It's not part of a kind of cohesive sequential narrative with a beginning and an end point. It's not a step on a progressive journey into the future. Instead, the lockout is more of a kind of focal point, or a nexus even, around which time and memory sort of coalesce. Everything beforehand is a kind of build up to it. Everything afterwards, is kind of flowing from it and kind of remains in its shadow. Or perhaps you might even say it's a kind of point that is kind of out of time almost, where the kind of regular pattern of life, or the flow of time, is disrupted and suspended for the duration of the lockout for that 3 months, and giving people, or young men in particular, and some young women, a glimpse of a very, very different world. So there are a number of kind of different temporal frameworks, I think, a number of different ways of thinking about time when it comes to remembering 1921 and 26. You have these ones, plus the kind of linear narratives of kind of time as progress and moving forward, and this sort of forward march of labour. And obviously, I think probably to some perhaps this might seem fairly abstract, and it's crucial to ask always why this is really important or significant. And the reason why I think this is important is because these kind of linear temporalities, where time is always moving forward, where the passage of time is closely tied to ideas of progress, are really fundamental or foundational even to the development of modern industrial capitalism. There's nothing at all really that's innate or natural about this idea of linear time, or time as idea of progress. Indeed, throughout human history, both in this country and particularly in other cultures around the world as well, people have always thought about time in very, very different ways. There's a very famous essay by E.P. Thompson, Time, Work Discipline and Industrial Capitalism, where he makes these exact same points and really kind of discusses how this particular view of time was essential to the development of industrial capitalism and its assumptions about progress, growth, development, accumulation and work, and all these other sorts of concepts. And historians such as Vanessa Ogle and Giordano Nani more recently kind of subsequently argued the kind of imposition of this particular way of seeing time and this particular view of time on communities both here and across the world are really a kind of crucial part of the spread of global capitalism. And the heroic narratives of the forward march of labour, even though they kind of directly oppose and challenge kind of capitalism in many senses and look forward to its overthrow or to the advent of socialism, still actually are adopting this kind of underlying perspective on time. They're working within that framing that has already been laid out. And though they're trying to kind of subvert and sort of challenge it to an extent, they're nevertheless doing so, having already accepted that initial framing and conceded that initial ground and that initial underlying temporal logic. This other collective memory of 21 of the summer and the soup kitchens, by contrast, is rejecting those terms and that framing entirely. And that's why I think they're so interesting, even if they can be classed as kind of a little bit nostalgic and romanticised possibly, that we can say even within kind of South Wales, which is kind of one of the birthplaces of the Industrial Revolution, this kind of triumph in terms of ways of seeing time is still really being resisted and contested, even as late as the 1970s. And I think a part of the reason why these memories of time are so so enduring and remained more widespread than the forward march of labour sort of narratives, particularly within the interviews, and these crop up much more than those kind of sequential sort of linear narratives, might be to do with, I think, that idea of progress as well. On a day-to-day basis, most miners' experience of progress would have been of the amalgamation of the coal mines and of mechanisation within the collieries, which were all processes which were experienced as a direct attack on conditions, on autonomy and control, and kind of experienced as a kind of alienating and de-skilling sort of process. I don't have too much time to go into that in detail, but I can do afterwards if anyone's interested. But this is particularly, you can see this particularly well in Bert Lewis Coombs' Count These Poor Hands as well, I think. And so I just wanted to finish therefore with a second reflection from Walter Benjamin, who in response to kind of Marx's famous dictum that revolutions, or we might paraphrase here, strikes or lockouts, that are the locomotives of history, Benjamin suggested instead that revolutions were the mean by which humanity aboard the speeding train attempted to apply the emergency brake. And I think it's this key point, I think, I would argue about Memories of 21, that it wasn't remembered as part of a progressive march towards somewhere else, but instead remembered as an experience that showed that perhaps didn't need to be a march at all in the first place. But that's the end. Thank you very much for listening. And also I just want to give a quick acknowledgement as well to the Miners' Library and the South Wales Coalfield Collection for use of some of the images here, which I didn't actually request before 9:15 this morning, but many thanks, Sean, for allowing me to continue with the photos. This photo comes from they've put together a brilliant resource on the kind of experience of 21 and the lockout, where you can kind of listen to kind of sections from a lot of the recordings and see a lot of these photos. So if you are interested more, please do follow the link, because it's really, really excellent resource that they put together back in April, and it's a great for further read done. But thank you very much. Brilliant.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you. That was a really fascinating and I think wide-ranging discussion there of not only the significance of 1921 in its own right, but also thinking in how memories have been shaped within the labour movement and by individuals as well. And I think it really highlights the significance of your work as well. So thank you so much for that. Before I open the floor to questions, and there are quite a few in the chat, I first of all wanted to ask you some questions myself. I think you're taking us in looking at 1921 to a really fascinating period, just very much in the shadow of the war here, the attempt to return to normality, to restructure the economy. This is on the back as well of course, significant events in Russia, to say the least, the radicalization of parts of the trade union movement, the extension of the franchise, and of course, serious race rioting a few years earlier as well. So my first question then is really, given the significance of 1921, as you've shown, and also the fact that in the oral histories collected in the 1970s, this was highlighted as a significant event by many of the respondents. I wondered why you thought the historians of Wales and of South Wales and the labour movement in particular have neglected to kind of give 1921 the attention that it deserves.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. It's a really interesting question. I don't think there's any kind of single or easy answer really. So, and it's kind of probably its most conspicuous absence is from kind of the Fed, which is kind of like a really landmark study in which kind of a lot of the work has flowed from since. And I think there possibly its absence is kind of almost a kind of consequence of kind of accidental circumstance, really, in that they're kind of commissioned to write this history of the South Wales Miners' Union, and they're kind of following on from Robin Page Arnott's work, which is kind of already covered up to 1926. So they kind of begin in 1926. So I think Francis Smith do kind of recognise it as being really significant, but their kind of work is on later. And as for other kind of historians, I think there's probably just the extent of similarity really between 21 and 26, in that if you're kind of writing a history of 26, it's not actually that dissimilar to reading a history of what reading a history of 21 would be either. I think a lot of the experiences are very, very similar. And I think that I guess as historians, we're kind of all kind of more drawn really towards the kind of what we see as the kind of bigger or more significant events, and kind of the fact that there was this greater lockout has kind of tended to be able to be seen as tended to mean 1921 has kind of been seen within its shadow really as well. But I think also that quite a lot of the historians kind of also work within, and I do this myself as well, but they're kind of working within this kind of implicit narrative of kind of the forward march of labour, and kind of trying to chart this kind of narrative. And if you're looking at it from that perspective, 26 is much more significant, which is why perhaps as well a lot more people focus on it. And you kind of have to kind of try and invert that, I think, to kind of try and see 21 as being as important as it is. But I think Darryl's talked about it a bit in his recent book as well. There's a good section on 21 there. So yeah, I think it's a kind of a range of different factors really. I think occasionally it's kind of accidental circumstance, occasionally it's just people being drawn towards the bigger dispute, and occasionally it's kind of that kind of framework and understanding of history.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the kind of relationship with 1926 is really interesting, and particularly as you've shown there, the kind of imagery of soup kitchens, the summer sunshine, the chance for kind of young men who are used to life underground, kind of being that feeling of being outside for the first time and able to fully enjoy the summer as well. I think the parallels are really significant and interesting. And also kind of how memories have been shaped around these two events as well. So the second thing I wanted to ask you about then is this kind of difference in the way that 1921 is recalled in collective memories, in contrast then to the way you began your talk with by stating how the labour movement kind of recalled 1921 and this kind of betrayal and the idea of framing it in that particular way. I was interested in these positive memories of communal action, the good weather, the behaviour of the shopkeepers. And I wondered, and I used the phrase, a young man's memories as well. And I wondered whether you felt there was a sense that this was a way in which men and women were making sense of their lives in the 1970s, and how 1921 has been remembered as part of making sense of how the world was shifting and changing in the 1970s, the level of trade union disputes in those years, and the place of the Labour Party as well in those years.
Yeah, it's a kind of question that's kind of bedeviled me really throughout kind of all my research. So my original kind of idea when I started my PhD was I wanted to do kind of collective memory in the interwar years, and kind of use the interviews in the 1970s to do so, which is obviously kind of poses such massive methodological challenges in terms of how these memories have changed over time. I think that question is kind of one that I continually kind of grapple with really, about how far kind of subsequent events have affected the kind of auras interviews and to what extent these are being reflected, because it's kind of really important and crucial to acknowledge that obviously people are not going to be remembering it in 1970 in the same way that they would have thought about it in the immediate aftermath or the immediate aftermath in the 1920s as well. But I think sometimes that kind of we always have to start with that assumption, but I do think sometimes that can be taken a little bit too far, in that I think sometimes people often tend to you almost end up in a situation where people's memories are being reinvented with every new experience they have. And I think there's a much more reciprocal kind of relationship. So that the memories of 21 and 26 are kind of important in terms of how people are seeing 1970s, as well as how the experience of the 1970s are very important in terms of how they later come to see 1921 and 26 as well. So whilst it's obviously, and that kind of is what makes it very, very difficult, because you obviously can't kind of start with the kind of memories in the 1970s and try and imagine that this is how they were in the 20s. But I don't think you can really start in the 1970s and assume that they're being this way because they're being affected by the 70s as well, without knowing there's that kind of reciprocal reaction that you've got to unpick, which is quite difficult, I think. I think there's some interest in, there's a mass observation, for instance, which is a kind of, if you're not familiar, is a sort of social observation sort of program, I guess. It's carried out, begins in the 1930s, to kind of really look at sort of public opinion and kind of how people are thinking. And they do a study of Bliner and anti-glow in the kind of late 1930s and early 1940s, in the years of the Second World War. And people talk about 1921 in the same way in this study as well. So if you look through the study and the kind of, and these are obviously kind of, you can't take them quite at face value because they're not direct recordings of people, but they're kind of basically kind of, you know, some sort of researcher kind of writing down their notes afterwards. But I think even by the 1940s, they're kind of sort of being seen in this way as well, as this kind of turning point and as this kind of positive experience. But I mean, that's one area of the coalfields 20 years afterwards. So I said it's really difficult. But yeah, in answer to your question stuff, I don't really know, sorry. It's and in kind of my thinking about trying to how to work through these issues, although I kind of, you know, I wouldn't try to sort of suggest that memories of 21 and 26 are kind of unchanged in the 1970s. I think trying to actually unpick how the 1970s would have influenced these memories is just as difficult and just as problematic.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting for you to say as well that, you know, in some respects, those mass observation reports show that you know, there's a kind of similar narrative that will be informed so soon after the events as well. Yeah, thank you. Rather than interrogate you any further, I think I'll open the floor now to questions. And right, so I'll just have a look through the chat. Or Darren, did you have some set up ready?
Yeah,
the chat is full of praise for you, by the way, David, as well.
That's the first thing I was going to say. Yeah, can I echo everybody else in the chat saying what a brilliant talk and what interesting questions as well. Well done, David. Brilliant. The first one, it was kind of comes from me initially, and then picked up by Steve Davis. How do you think 21 and 26 impacted on Labour, almost a third of Labour seats in the disastrous 1931 election coming from the South Wales coalfield? Steve has picked up on that and given us some stats in there and pointed to the shadow of mine, which suggests this the depth of radical politics is embraced by South Wales. But any opinions on that, David?
Not so much, no, really. I mean, just safe to echo that point because it's so fascinating. I think I can't see the stats, so I can't scroll up that far. But my understanding is that I think pretty much the Labour vote declines pretty much everywhere in the country, apart from the coalfield seats in South Wales, where it actually rises in almost every seat, kind of very much out of step with that sort of national trajectory, which is absolutely fascinating. I think, yeah, I think the problem with saying whether 21 and 26 had a direct impact on this is that, you know, it's not just South Wales that experiences 21 and 26. This kind of national strikes, and actually, if you look at the coalfield seats, I think in Yorkshire and Lancashire, which pretty much the only other, sorry, not Yorkshire and Lancashire, I think it's Yorkshire and Durham, which are probably the only other seats that kind of remain kind of consistently Labour at that time. The votes actually declines quite massively there, and they only hang on to them basically because their initial majorities were so large. So there is something that happens in South Wales. I confess I'm not a political historian, so I don't really trace the kind of emergence, but I think certainly the experience of this kind of collective action yeah, I think there's a lot of talk at the moment, so particularly following on from the general election in 2019, on how kind of the Labour Party didn't really build any kind of, or wasn't able to successfully build any kind of sort of basis within kind of communities or kind of rebuild that kind of trade union movement, which, I mean, it was doing so in incredibly difficult conditions and circumstances, obviously. But I think the fact that in 21 and 26, you've got this such a powerful kind of building of community action and community spirit, I think probably impacts on it, must have some impact. But as I said, I'm not a political historian really, so I wouldn't like to speculate too much on a direct link between those really interesting votes in 31 and 21, 26, but I'd be very interested to hear anyone else's speculations on those.
Great answer, to be honest. Kim Colebrook's asking, and I think you answered this in answering Steph a little bit, how do memories gathered in the 70s compare with the accounting reports collected in 21 and 26?
Yeah, I don't think they're directly comparable really, because I mean the kind of reports and the accounts that are gathered in 21 and 26 aren't really coming from a lot of the kind of the men and women in the coalfields. So certainly if you look at the kind of elements that you do have, you know, where kind of people are writing letters into things like the Colliery Workers magazine or to the press, and they are comparing very differently. So there is a kind of general assumption that there's a kind of despondency and a kind of despair has kind of settled over the coalfield, which contrasts massively to these kind of very nostalgic and kind of romanticized memories in the 70s. But I think there is these kind of letters are very much a kind of self-selecting sample as well. So they're not, I don't think, directly comparable to the kind of people who are being interviewed by the Coalfields History Project in the 70s. But I think, yeah, they do suggest it. But I think it's quite interesting. I don't think the idea of the lockout as this kind of disaster or this despondency necessarily directly contradicts some of the memories of the kind of positive experience of the time as well. I think it's still possible to see the kind of defeat of the lockout and kind of be despondent after the defeat of the lockout, while still thinking of 1921 as a great time and a great experience also. But yeah, again, I'm not doing very well in answering these questions, sorry, but yeah, again, I don't think it's a really interesting question, but I don't think there isn't the material that I have found anyway that allows you to really make a direct comparison. So it's kind of very difficult to really say or to do much more than speculate, really.
I think you are doing really well answering these questions, so we'll have to differ on that one. Then Sian Rhiannon points to the methodology again of the South Wales Coalfield Project as reflected on the interviewers rather than the interviewees and labour historians in South Wales in the 1970s. And the question would be, were the women interviewed wives, were they interviewed separately or with their husbands?
Mostly interviewed separately, so there are a few sort of joint interviews. The original interviews that were recorded, because there's several different kind of sets of interviews really in the miners' side. So you got kind of like the first Coalfield History Project, which I think is, I mean, Sian will know better than me, but I think it's kind of close to around about 200 interviews that's kind of recorded between 72 and 74. Within those, there are a handful of joint interviews, so you do get men and women being interviewed together, but the majority of interviews with women in there are with women kind of being interviewed on their own, basically. There aren't a huge number of women in that initial sample. There are kind of more in the later kind of recordings, and there's a particularly really good set of interviews that were recorded by Philippa Dolan, I think in 1975. I need to check the dates, who I haven't been able to find out too much about since, actually. But her interviews are kind of all with women in the kind of Upper Swansea Valley, and they're kind of, none of them are recorded with husbands. Some of them are recorded with groups of women, so there's kind of 2 or 3 women on the tape, which are really, really interesting recordings. But mostly, yeah, they're interviewed separately or singly where they're spoken to.
If I could interject here.
Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I wondered if you might say a little bit more about the gender dimension to the 1921 dispute. I think our knowledge of the role that women played in 1926 has, been greatly enhanced by the work of people like Sian Rhiannon Williams and Sue Brewley and Steve Thompson. I wondered whether you'd looked at, or compared at all the role of women between 1921 and 1926, or at least the way in which women's roles were remembered.
So yeah, it's much more the latter really on kind of how women's roles are remembered. So my kind of research is much more limited for the actual kind of disputes themselves. And one thing I did see, which was quite interesting when I was kind of going back to my notes, which I hadn't even really noticed at the time, was that there seems to be a lot less strike breaking in 1921 than 26, which I think is possibly a consequence of the kind of dispute being much shorter. It's only 3 months and you only have the summer as well. So there's no, you don't have that kind of hard time kind of over the winter and into the autumn, which I think leads a lot of people to return into work. I think that a lot of the kind of talk on the experience of women in 1926, I think, and then the kind of material on women in 1926 and their role in the dispute comes partly through those kind of that compulsion of strike breakers and blacklegs. So there's a lot less information, unfortunately, really, because there's so much less examples of it, seemingly.
Yeah.
In terms of the memory, it is quite different. So in 1926, there's much less of a sort of gender dimension to these positive memories. So it's much more of a kind of age factor. So women who were young in 1926 will remember it in much the same way as kind of glorious summer weather, having a great time, being involved in the soup kitchens and so forth. In 21, you don't get that. There's very few women who kind of remember it that way in 21. I'm not sure whether that might just be a kind of quirk of the kind of number of recordings there were and who they spoke to.
Yeah.
But there is, it does seem to be, I would say in terms of memories, it's much more refracted by age than by gender in terms of the difference, is my experience from the recordings.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's much more work to be done there in the kind of
Absolutely,
spaces women were moving in as well, and the significance of 21 as part of that process. Yeah, thank you. If we return to the chat, Neil Evans has commented that I think 1926 in many ways prefigured in the Cardiff General Strike in 1911 and the railway strike in 1919, but no evidence of collective memories of these. No one recorded them anywhere. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that or whether this is something you've noted.
I'm afraid not. No, I very little on. I don't think the Cardiff General Strikes come up at all on the recordings I've listened to, I'm afraid. So I don't have too much to say about that. But yeah, I think the sort of broader point to think about, these really being prefigured by the earlier disputes is very true. And I give the one example from the interview with W.T. Koenig, where he goes back to the Haulier strike, but particularly then as well to kind of 1910-11 and the minimum wage strike in 1912. And it's I think you have to kind of see it as a whole kind of period, really, from kind of around about 1910 to 1921, and then kind of almost, I would say, 1926 the kind of epilogue after that, really. I mean, it's that kind of whole 10 years, really. And obviously you've got the Dublin lockout in 1913 as well, and I think those kind of experiences are, and then the strikes on the railways obviously in 1919 as well. So
yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, Darren, did you want to raise anything else from the chat? You've been keeping a closer eye.
Yeah, to be honest, we could go on and on. How much time have we got, Steph?
I think we're asked to finish by 11:15, so I think as long as David's okay, I think we could keep going for a few more minutes.
Fab. So Alan Burge is again echoing what everybody else has said. Great talk. So Alan's been working on Mini Pallister. He put any more thoughts on? Hang on, 2 seconds. I got myself lost yet. The 21 lockout goes some way towards offsetting the overall experience of the Great War. I wish this was realised in the late 70s. Any more on relation of thoughts in 1922? Confused myself then, sorry.
Sorry, could you repeat that? Sorry, Darren.
Yeah, sorry. Alan's looking at how the impact of following the 1921 strike and how that impacts on 1922. So it's the overall experience of Great War into 21, and then how that carries on between, I suppose, between 21 and 26.
Well, the impact on the 22 election, no?
Yeah.
I mean, I think Alan probably be able to speak to that much more confidently than I would. I'm not really a political historian, so I haven't looked too much at the kind of direct impact on kind of electoral kind of patterns. I'm going to try and trace that kind of impact from the kind of industrial disputes onto the kind of electoral politics. I think these kind of forms of collective action obviously are kind of very important in kind of generating a kind of class consciousness and a kind of sense of kind of community consciousness within South Wales and the coalfield. And to that extent, they're obviously going to strengthen the labour movement to some extent as well. So I think there's obviously going to be a connection there, but as I said, I'm not really a political historian, so I don't really feel confident speculating too much on direct sort of impacts between the strikes and lockouts and on electoral politics. But I'd be very interested to hear if anyone else has any thoughts they wanted to share on that.
Thanks, David. So Stuart Sant then, how and why is the psychology of the general public altered between 21 and 26 is quite a subject. It's a curious fact the war memorials were by and large erected later in industrial communities elsewhere. In Anglesey, by and large, they were unveiled in 21. So I think what he's saying there is why the war memorials are why they erected later in industrial communities compared to other. I know that's going off topic a little bit, David, but any thoughts?
Okay, yeah, so I was just reading the comment in the chat. Yeah, I think it's a kind of, it is very much a watershed moment, I think, because and this is something that's true also kind of like the unemployment as well, and the kind of hunger marches as well, where you get kind of, there's one particularly interesting recollection where someone kind of was on this kind of hunger march after 1921, one of the first hunger marches in 22, and when they reach, I can't remember where the destination is now, but they reach, I think, Swindon or Redden or somewhere, and they propose to put them up in the workhouse, and this kind of veteran kind of pulls this flag, this Union Jack flag from his baggage, and so they didn't fight under that for 4 years, to be stuck in a workhouse, and then they eventually put them up in this kind of this hall instead. But I think it's from what I would, this might be slightly disagreeing actually with the kind of thrust of what Alan's saying in terms of if you're talking about memorials and the kind of memorialization process. But from what I've seen in the kind of recordings and what it's that kind of experience in 1921, and particularly the unemployment that kind of follows it, is a kind of casts kind of the experience of the war in a kind of particularly different light, and kind of leads it to being seen much more as a kind of sort of betrayal, or a kind of very much more negative experience than perhaps otherwise would have been, and kind of dispelling that kind of, I guess you get the kind of, was it the khaki or the coupon election in 1918, and that kind of jingoism at the end of the war. But yeah, I'd be interested to, because I think I'm not entirely sure I'm quite getting at what Alan's saying. Sorry, so.
No, that's no problem. So Andrew Chalmers, he's complimented you. He's dealt really well with longitudinal labour. I pronounce that wrong. Mythology, and he's suggesting a broader study of the South Wales communities, engaging with newspaper sources and other areas would be useful. Have you done any work on the 1929 and 1931 strikes, especially in the Garo?
Not especially the Garo strikes, no. So it's really quite, so I think that the issue with doing something specifically on kind of one of these smaller strikes is that whether you've actually got kind of enough interviews or memories of them to kind of suggest whether there's any kind of particular significance to those memories. So I think the Garo strikes are mentioned in one or two of the recordings, but you can't really build too much of an argument about a particular kind of memory of a particular dispute that's tied to the significance of that dispute off basically just kind of one or two recordings. And I think what is really interesting though, I think, is that because there's so many of these kind of much smaller disputes, there's kind of ones at 9 Mile Point as well. You've obviously got the kind of experience in 34 and 35 around sort of Taff Merthyr and Bedwas. And then kind of other forms of direct action as well. So you got the 1925 strike in the Anthracite Goldfield and kind of Blaenau riots in 1935. Is the way that so many of these kind of win these memories, where people are kind of using this kind of broader overarching framework of these kind of longitudinal histories, as you mentioned, these kind of histories of the labour movement, is that kind of narrative provides basically a framework, and then people are able to put those kind of individual experiences, these much smaller disputes within that framework. So, the pageant might talk about, stage a dramatic reenactment of police batons beating miners at in the Rhondda in 1910-11. When they stage this at Abertillery in 1939, a lot of people obviously going to be thinking of the Blaenau riots in 1935, where much the same thing happens, where police batons attack the kind of unemployed miners. So I think a lot of these smaller strikes do appear quite often, and where people are talking about and kind of not just strikes as well, but kind of other sort of forms of protest and direct action, and where people are kind of talking about them, they kind of, that narrative of the Forward March basically provides an overarching framework within which they can kind of fit their experiences then and their individual experiences, which I think is quite interesting. But as I said, that kind of tells you a bit more about the kind of idea of this Forward March and how kind of this sort of memory is working. It doesn't tell you too much about the disputes themselves, and I'm not sure there's probably a kind of enough of a critical mass of recordings on those topics to really comment on that.
That's really, really interesting. Again, this is all part of Andrew's question. Also, mass migration, was it solely the result of the unemployment in the 30s, or was it a sign of breakup of the coal complex among young miners as a result of the lockout? Now, I know there's a big historiography on the Darrow's decade, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I mean, there's a lot in terms of, you kind of look at the sort of social studies in the kind of 1930s, kind of Men Without Work and the Pilgrim Trust and things like that, which Seth would be much more familiar with. But there's kind of a lot talking exactly about that kind of coal complex and how have that experience of unemployment kind of actually made people question kind of whether this was actually what they want to do, and that's something that comes across so much in the interviews as well, as when people talk about their kind of experiences underground and their kind of why they went underground in the first place. It's kind of talked about as kind of something sort of axiomatic almost, that you kind of automatically go to the pits. That was just the sort of done thing. I think that the lockouts in 21 and 26 would have had a very similar impact here. I completely agree. I think that experience of not working for 7 months, particularly in 1926, and to a lesser extent as well in 21 lockout for the 3 months then as well, is obviously going to have a similar sort of effect, I think, to those experiences that people have with mass unemployment in the 1920s and 30s. And so, I mean, I don't have too much more to add, but I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I think they also do, these experiences start kind of undermining the sort of coal complex as well. The issue with kind of saying any more about it really is that, and with saying too much about migration in general, is that people who did leave the coalfields in the 1920s and 30s, many of them don't come back, and so they're not in the coalfield to be interviewed by the Coalfield History Project in the 1970s. So it's difficult to kind of go into too much more detail about why people moved and what were their kind of thinkings and whether that was kind of a direct impact. But yeah, no, I would completely agree. I think that's definitely a factor as well.
Good. Again, excellent, David. There's loads of really, really brilliant comments in there, but just dropping down the chat. So Jill's asking, 21 so close to the end of the war, how were communities affected by World War I, and was the period of peace and community more welcome because of the war?
I think it's very, very mixed, depending where you are. So, I mean, I kind of glossed over that a little bit in my kind of historical overview. I said there's a kind of short post-war boom, which kind of flattens like the experience of the coalfield into kind of one sort of image of kind of relatively prosperous period, which is actually very, very different depending on where you are. So in Blaenau, for instance, it's kind of 1920 really that kind of sees this sort of collapse. I think similar in Dowlais as well, with the kind of closure of the ironworks there. Obviously experience in Cardiff is very, very different as well, where you get the kind of the riots in 1919, which Steph mentioned earlier, the race riots, which are kind of also partly motivated by kind of unemployment stemming from the war. So it's a much more nuanced picture than I probably probably flattened it out a little bit in my talk. Where there was a post-war boom, I think that's probably true. I think there is a kind of a sort of more positive feeling kind of emerging as a kind of result of the end of the war. But it's so kind of patchwork really, and it's so that the experience is so different. I wouldn't say that's a general thing for South Wales really. It's in places where they did experience this kind of post-war boom, then yes, but in a lot of places that kind of fall or that kind of realization happens a lot earlier.
Yeah, Alan's redirecting it because I think I got the focus of Alan's question wrong. So what Alan was asking was, did the impact of 21 offset the overwhelming experience of the Great War, which again you sort of answered to the last question.
Thank you so much, Darren, for monitoring the chat in that way. That's been really helpful. I wonder if it might be a good idea now for David to look through the comments, and perhaps you could respond to some people individually if there's a more specific question. I also feel that we've given you a thorough questioning as well, and you might want to catch your breath slightly before we move on to the AGM. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody who's contributed to the chat. I think this has been a really interesting discussion on a wide range of one. And I also think it, shows the interest in your work, David, and the importance of it, not just in kind of mining those coalfield memories for what they tell us about 1921, but thinking much more carefully about how memories are framed in the idea of collective memories as well. I think it's also been nice for us to think about a kind of different Black Friday to the one that was happening yesterday. So thank you for that as well on a more light-hearted note. So thank you so much, David. It's a shame now we can't continue the discussion over a cup of tea and a Welsh cake or something, but I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody when we say thank you so much for such an excellent paper. Thank you. And I'll hand back over to Ieuan now.
Thanks, Steph, as well for chairing, and thanks everybody for coming, and to James and Sean and Ieuan and Darren for setting up and organising everything.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, David. Thanks, Steph. On behalf of everyone, I'd like to extend a grateful thanks to you, David, for exploring the links between 21 and 26 with such insight. Many thanks also to Steph for chairing the discussion, and to you, the audience, for your comments and questions. Grateful thanks to the extremely hardworking members of the Llafur Events Subcommittee for their help in organising and publicising this and indeed all of Llafur's recent online events. Before we end this part of today's proceedings, I wonder if I can just be permitted a quick membership plug. Our website includes a membership sign-up facility, a mere £15 to join, £10 for unwaged. So if you're not yet a member, please do consider joining. Our website also contains recordings of all our online events going back to summer 2020, when we first embarked on this new and exciting direction of travel in the history of Llafur. They really are worth a listen. Okay, so we're now going to have I believe a 15-minute comfort break, just time to grab a coffee, and then we'll be holding our annual general meeting via the Zoom link. If you are a Llafur member, I hope you'll be able to join us for this. If you're unable to stay, then thank you once again for joining us this morning, and we look forward, hopefully, to welcoming you back to more Llafur online events in the near future. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.